Hello friends and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm making a Finnish folk vest and apron from Askola. However, let's start by discussing Finnish folk vests in general. What do I mean when I use the word vest? A vest for me is a sleeveless bodice. In fact, often these kinds of garments are just called bodices, but as nowadays bodice often refers only to a part of a garment that covers the body from waist to neck, I prefer calling this garment a vest. The first records of folk vests in western Finland are from the middle of the 17th century. Originally vests were luxury items and made by professionals. These small garments were constructed so that it took less than 1 meter of fabric. Thus, the vests were a perfect garment of showing off expensive commercially made fabrics, such as velvets or patterned fine wools like florett or calamanco. Calamanco was wool twill and usually striped. In some stripes the color changed gradually from one shade to another. After weaving, the fabric was treated so that it got a beautiful shine. The vests were laced shut at the front and the laces were threaded through metallic decorative eyelets. I have no idea what these are called in English. The back of the vest sported pleats called körtti that helped to fit the vest over the skirt. It was important to fluff the körttis so that they stood high and emphasized women's narrow waist and wider hips. Before presenting themselves to the menfolk, the women checked each other's körttis so that they stood properly in attention. At the beginning of the 19th century, the vests had become commonplace and the use of the garment had spread over the whole Finland. It became more and more common to make these garments at home out of hand-woven fabrics. Striped hand-woven fabrics had linen warp and wool weft, and the patterns imitated the stripy patterns of more expensive imported calamanco fabrics, although often with smaller variety of colors. Lacing was still common, but buttons also appeared as an alternative. In eastern part of the country, the vest came as a new thing in the early 19th century. In Savonia and Karelia, vests got a new, more looser look that was taken directly from men's vests. These vests were many blue, which was an expensive and thus valued color. These vests were not designed to offer support, but only warmth, so they were only fastened at the waist level. Meanwhile, in the western and southern Finland, the fashion had its impact on folk dresses as well. While in the east the whole concept of the vest was still new, the original long vests were becoming old-fashioned in the west, where even folk women saw more fashionable dresses on women of higher class. The folk vest became shorter to imitate the empire or regency bodice. As cotton became both available and affordable, more and more vests were made out of cotton instead of wool. The Askola costume vest is from the early 19th century, but it is still rather long. In many ways, this vest is a typical 18th century vest with its laced closure and simple pattern. The back pieces are cut so that the stripes of the fabric form a pretty V-shape. Here is the fabric I wore by myself. It has been soaked in water and steamed thoroughly. The first thing to do was to make the pattern fit to my shape. Just by looking at the pattern I could see that the vest was way too short for my long back. Even before I made a mock-up, I added 2 centimeters height to the waist and another 2 to the shoulder. The mock-up fitted pretty well. I only needed to take out a tiny bit at the back princess seam. Before cutting, I thread traced the pattern pieces onto the fabric. A typical folk vest doesn't have side seams. However, when one makes a national costume, one must take into account that this costume is going to live longer than its maker. Furthermore, I don't know if I'll keep in this size forever. Thus, I decided to add hidden side seams that will allow me or any other future owner to let out the vest easily. Before I did anything else, I overcasted the edges. I used the leftover wool from the weaving to save the linen for later. The first thing to sew was the center back seam. Here aligning the stripes is very important. I basted the seam first and then sewed the seam with back stitches. The front is interlined with hair canvas that is pat stitched in place. These are just basting stitches to hold the canvas in place while I patch stitch. I started the patch stitching from the middle since patch stitching may shrink the canvas a bit. I try to pick up as little as possible from the outer fabric so that my patch stitches remain invisible from the right side. I hold my finger on the right side just where my stitch goes. This way I can feel if my stitch goes in too deep. After the patch stitching, I can sew the side seams and the princess seams at the back. However, I didn't sew the shoulder seams even though my pattern instructed to. For me, it makes more sense if I insert the lining while I can still lay my vest flat. I can add the lining. The edges of the vest are turned inwards and basted in place. I notch the curved edges to create nice and smooth curves. I press all the edges carefully. The clapper helps to soak up remaining moisture from the fabric and it helps to create smoother finish both at the edges and at the seams. The lining is sturdy unbleached linen. I am now marking the seam allowance on the lining pieces. I can now notch the seam allowances without going over the seam line. For me, this is the best part in the garment construction. I love attaching the lining in this old-fashioned way. This method is so precise and satisfying. As you can see, I started from the front pieces and then moved towards the back. Here I realized I made a small mistake. Luckily I noticed it before I had sewn the lining in place. Now I can slip stitch the lining in place. The seams of the lining pieces are sewn only now. Now I need to give more shape to the kurtis. I'm stitching through this seam here and that will perk up the folds nicely. I'll sew the shoulder seams now. I had left some of the lining around the shoulder seams loose to make sewing the seams a bit easier. Now that the vest is looking pretty good, let's skip to the apron project. I was really lucky with this apron fabric. Föreningen had run out of the apron fabric that was needed for this costume. However, they found an unfinished apron at the storage that had enough fabric for my apron. Well, it was a few centimeters too narrow, but who would know it? I even got a nice discount. The sides and the hem were already folded and finished. I could keep the sides, but I had to unpick the hem as it was too wide for my apron and I made a narrower hem. This also gave me just enough fabric to make this apron long enough for me. Here is the original Askola apron. The apron has been made from a commercial cotton gauze fabric with flowers and stripes woven in. Unfortunately, you can't really get a fabric like this anymore. My fabric is embroidered cotton that has vertical floral pattern and that is the best I can do. The apron is pleated in narrow little pleats. I didn't measure the width of them, but I trusted my eye here. Now I'm making the waistband. The waistband is first backstitched on. I didn't bother to trim the waistband before sewing, but can now both trim away the extra seam allowance and cut the waistband to its final size. An apron used to be a sign of a respectable woman. There were many different folk beliefs what came to aprons. It was said that an apronless woman was a lawless woman. The apron protected against unwanted attention from the men and protected women's purity. Meeting a woman without an apron on a journey meant bad luck. One folk belief was that if a woman got her apron wet, she got a drunkard for a husband. Well, and that was one way of shifting blame. I wonder if there was a single woman who hadn't spilled water on their apron when washing dishes. A pure presence of an apron was somehow magical. A dropped apron signaled coming evil, but an apron hanged onto the door of a barn kept the animals from escaping. You could also call good luck to your cows by throwing an apron over a newborn calf. In some parts of the country, women also believed that you couldn't make proper butter without wearing an apron. However, another belief stated that butter churning went even better if you turned your apron to your left side and said some magical words. What those words were, I don't know. The waistband doesn't actually go around the waist. Instead, the ends are folded back to make loops, and a separate cotton tape is used to tie the apron on. The apron is finished and I can try the vest on. It still needs a closure, and that means I have to make sure I know where my waistline is. The vest is supposed to form horizontal pleats from the back kurtis to the front. The exact shape of the pleats depends on the shape of the person, but these pleats help the vest sit over the skirts. For some reason, the instructions told to sew these pleats in place. However, when I look at the original vest, the pleats are not sewn in place. I asked some experts and they confirmed that in most folk vests the pleats are not sewn in place except at the point just under the kirtis, where the pleats help to perk up the folds. So I decided to go with the historical evidence and leave the folds unsewn. The vest has a hidden cord closure that I'm making next. For that, I need to measure the distance from the bottom of the neckline to my waist. I'm marking the places for the holes. The both sides are different as this vest has a spiral lacing. I don't want to weaken the fabric by cutting any holes. Therefore, I'm using an awl to make a hole and then widen it using some knitting needles. Then I can just overcast the edges of the holes. The lacing strips are now sewn in place. This last row of running stitches helps to distribute the strain better. Remember how important it was to get those back pleats nice and perky? Well, now we are stitching down some of the folds so that these pleats stay nicely in place. There is a horizontal pleat just under the kirtis that lifts them up nicely. It now needs to be sewn in place. I made a small error when I fastened my lining. I was being too neat and kept my stitches invisible from the right side. However, the stitches were supposed to show and form tiny indents. This will also keep the edges sharp and neat. To get this effect, I went around the edges one extra time with brick stitches. This really improves the look of the edges. I had plenty of linen cord that I used for my loom. I thought it was a perfect material for making the laces for my vest. The cord is rather long, so I can slip in without needing to take it off completely. In case I need to rethread the cord, I left a hairpin that I used as a needle in place at the end of the cord. Some of my stitches that held up the folds at the back were a bit too loose. Later I went back and corrected those stitches to keep the white thread hidden. Thank you for watching. You can support my channel just by liking and subscribing. If you want to donate money, there's a link to my Ko-fi page down below in the description. I warmly thank all my Ko-fi donators. See you soon. Bye!